evening and welcome to the WDSU News Hot Seat. I'm Travers Mackel. In just a few days, President-elect Donald Trump will take the oath of office to become leader of the free world. Tonight, we are talking about that in depth with a good panel. Dr. Silas Lee from Xavier University, Dr. Ed Chervenek from the University of New Orleans, and then Eric Skrmetta, Republican Public Service Commissioner, who also was the chair of Trump for Louisiana. Let's just start off with you, Mr. Skrmetta. President-elect Donald Trump is sworn in Friday. It's a day a lot of people have been waiting for, but a lot of people didn't think this would happen last fall as he was in what was a very contentious election with Hillary Clinton.
No, absolutely. But, you know, elections are contentious, and as the result, you have a winner, and we have a new president that's going to be sworn in, and he's going to do everything he can to improve the economy and the society of the United States. And I think people are going to be very happy with him.
His first press conference just a few days ago was somewhat combative, some would say. He was very direct, but also combative. What does Donald Trump have to do to bring this country closer together? Because obviously there were a lot of people out there who didn't vote for him.
Well, I think the combativeness was only from one reporter from CNN. I think for the most part, the president-elect was very responsive to the press corps. And I think that what he's going to do to bring America together is to do exactly what he's been planning on, which is improve the condition for providing jobs and employment and improve the overall economy for the country. And I think as a priority, I think that's going to do a lot to really help the people of the country, you know, find their way, because you know, the old expression of everybody floats on a rising tide is true. We want people to be employed and gainfully employed in good jobs, and I think that we've already seen before he's even taken office that the response from many industries is to reinvest in the United States.
Dr. Chervenek, you've followed this obviously very closely, as have you. Dr. Lee, it's a day a lot of people have been waiting for. What do you expect to hear from Donald Trump on Friday?
Well, obviously, what inauguration speeches typically do is lay out a vision for the future, what he wants to do for the country, and what direction he wants to take the country in. And I think he does need to address the millions of people who do not vote for him, that he does need to reach out. We really haven't seen a whole lot of outreach from the Trump campaign to those who aren't necessarily for him. So I think there's an opportunity to basically speak to all Americans.
How do you feel about it, Dr. Lee?
Well, we always have contested presidential elections. However, in this political environment, what makes it unique, Hillary Clinton received more than 2 million popular votes. However, he enters office with the highest unfavorable, and he has established a high bar for himself. Remember the wall. He has also promised not reducing the deficit, as well as increasing funding for the military. So there are a lot of policy priorities, especially when you get to the issue of the Affordable Care Act and other initiatives. So now he has to govern. Running a campaign was the easy part. Governing and trying to manage the 535 members of Congress, that's very difficult.
Let's talk about campaign promises. There were many, including the wall, which you just touched on, Dr. Lee. Mr. Skrmetta, can he hold true to all of these campaign promises? A lot of people feel it's going to be an uphill task, everything he promised during the campaign, to bring to reality as a president.
I think there's difficulty anytime you make all the commitments you make, but I think you've also seen a willingness to attempt to accomplish them. And what we're seeing now is he's already fulfilling the promises on employment and being the cheerleader to drive the resurgence and renaissance of American industry. And I feel very confident that there will be response through all of the aspects of how we guard our borders, through not only just the wall, but improved work for our border agents and security. And I think you're going to find that that will be a task that's actually very achievable. But I think that when we really look at this, we're really looking at probably the most difficult thing is to find a way to deal with the massive debt that we've accumulated under the previous president. And I think that how that drives the economy when we look at how the cost of that debt is affecting it. So he's got his hands full, but he's been very determined. He's a problem solver, and I think he can accomplish what goals he sets for himself.
Let me ask you all this. When President Obama went into office 8 years ago, there was a Republican House and a Democratic House, Democratic Senate. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, passed without a Republican vote. Donald Trump now has Republican Senate, Republican House. Will that help him getting getting legislation through, especially given the fact that he ran as the anti-DC, we're going to drain the swamp candidate?
You know, rhetoric is one thing, and trying to govern and get policies passed in a contentious political environment is a completely different story. All elected representatives and senators, they have to be accountable to the people who put them in office. So what he will find is, yes, he does have a Republican Congress. It doesn't mean that a Republican Congress will automatically rubber stamp everything, because they will have to be responsive to their constituents. Some things, yes, we've seen them make some steps towards repealing some aspects of the Affordable Care Act. However, in other pieces of legislation, it's going to be a tough battle, because it's not just one party, it's also the Democrats too. And they will have some tough initiatives in terms of trying to support the agenda of President-elect Trump.
There was an editorial in one of the papers recently about Republicans who could oppose Donald Trump. John McCain was one, Marco Rubio, another one, Lindsey Graham. Could he see some pushback, even though it is a Republican majority in the Senate and the House?
Well, we're already seeing some pushback in the confirmation hearings, particularly for the Secretary of State designate. What we're seeing is those three Republican senators push back on Russia. They're not very happy about Donald Trump's attitude towards Russia, his kind of buddy-buddy approach with Vladimir Putin, and so that's one area where they can really push back on him. And you know, particularly the House members, they're up for re-election in 2 years, and you know, it's easy. It's one thing to say, yeah, we're going to repeal Obamacare, and that's the easy part, and it's still very difficult to do. The harder part is the replacement, and we really haven't heard any details on the replacement. All we keep hearing is, well, we're going to have a better plan, it's going to be cheaper, and so everyone's going to be happy. But unless they can come through with some sort of replacement without the mandate, without the taxes, it's difficult to see how they're going to get this done.
Mr. Skrmetter, you've met with Donald Trump personally. You've been somebody who's been with this campaign for a very long time. You touched on the fact that he's a businessman. You're in government, and you understand this. Sometimes the wheels of government spin very slowly. Do you think he understands that, and do you think he's going to have a hard time dealing with that? Because even if an idea is a good idea, sometimes getting it through Congress and the Senate is a battleground, and it's very difficult?
Well, I think it's about, you know, your perspective and your will, because I've actually been accused by some of my seatmates of making government go too quick. And I think that if the president-elect wants to make government move quicker, he can. But I think what probably the biggest concern will be sort of the approach of a lot of the people who are going to be coming into the cabinet are coming from business, and it's going to be just a different experience for them on how they run their departments. But I do think is that there's going to be a movement to adjust the thinking, and I think that the rank and file federal employees are going to have to find a way to survive with this new mindset.
Go ahead.
Well, these are career bureaucrats. Their mindset's not going to change, because administrations come and they go, but these career bureaucrats, they're there forever. And so, you know, this might be the first time where someone's going to be able to tell Donald Trump no, that we're not going to do this, or we can't do this. And so it'll be interesting to see how he responds to that.
Go ahead, Dr. Lee.
That's another reality in terms of being a businessman. Yes, he is very successful. However, it's a family-run business. And now you have to deal with being accountable not only to the members of Congress, but so many other agencies. So it's a different environment, and you're talking about a very steep learning curve very quickly. He has to submit a budget within the next couple of weeks, and that's going to be a daunting challenge, as well as many of the cabinet members, they do not have the governmental experience to navigate this very tough environment. So it's going to be a steep learning curve.
Let's talk about some of his appointments, and we'll just start with you, Dr. Lee, and go right back down the line here. From Jeff Sessions on the way down, do you expect everybody to get confirmed, or could there be pushback where you see some of these appointees or designated people start to drop off?
Well, you will have pushback. However, in terms of getting confirmation, it looks like most of them, they are on the road to getting some form of confirmation, getting confirmed. Sessions, I think, will he generated the most opposition. For the first time, you had a sitting senator testify in opposition to his nomination, but it looks like the other cabinet members will get confirmation. Big question mark, though, is clearing everything that the FBI requires in terms of the background checks. So that can hold up some, we have to see.
Yeah, they did move on these hearings very quickly. And in fact, there have been charges that they haven't completed some of the review. I agree that most of them, if not all of them, will probably get through. I think there'll be some pushback on the Tillerson appointment because of his close relationship with Vladimir Putin. They really want to know where this guy stands and what he thinks. And it was kind of interesting to see how a lot of these designates really diverged from Donald Trump's viewpoint on Russia, that they were going to be very tough on Russia, very tough on Putin, where Donald Trump's been very accommodating with Vladimir Putin.
Let's talk about this, if we can, Mr. Skrmetta. You were a prosecutor at one time earlier in your career in another...
No.
No?
Nope, never been a prosecutor. I've been a defense attorney for a while.
Excuse me.
That's okay.
What does a Jeff Sessions Department of Justice look like?
You know, I think people are grossly overreacting to Jeff Sessions as a potential attorney general. When he was the U.S. attorney, he was very aggressive. He brought convictions against the KKK. He also upended issues on opening and securing voting rights for African Americans. He is very much a simple thing. He is a law and order kind of guy. So he will follow the statute, he will follow that to the letter. And he is not going to try and bend it or manipulate it. But what they'll find is, with Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, he will accomplish the tasks of his job, and he will follow the law implicitly.
Final question, because we are running out of time. We could talk for a half an hour about this. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time. When it comes to local appointments, it's an important thing here. Federal judgeships, U.S. attorney, not just here, but throughout the state. How much jockeying is going on for that right now, and how key will that be for the president to recommend or to appoint the right people in this district?
Well, I think we already have some jockeying going on.
I think there's
right
a lot
now.
of jockeying going on, right?
So, and I'm quite sure that he will appoint members to various positions that will, one, support his agenda, and that he feels that he can trust, and who will be loyal to his agenda.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, with the Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, the top law enforcement guy, I think not locally, but certainly, what's his approach going to be towards the states that have legalized marijuana? Because he is a staunch opponent of legalized marijuana, and so it'll be interesting to see how he addresses those states who have legalized marijuana, and that could be a real conflict between the federal government and the state governments.
Final question. You've been a key player in this. How busy has your phone been, and how many people, how much competition is there for a lot of these federally appointed positions here in this district?
Well, there's competition. I mean, what we're looking at are primarily judgeships, U.S. Attorney, and Marshal. Those are the primary ones that people are seeking. We've seen some people look into the various boards and commissions that the federal government has, which are not as well known. But the competition is there. We're looking and trying to promote everyone to be reviewed. And I think that what you're going to find is our congressional delegation has great weight in what they determine moves forward to Vice President-elect, who's the head of the transmission team. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of appointments made until the cabinet is set. And once the cabinet's set, I think you'll see a rapid appointment of various. I mean, there's over 4,000 appointments in the executive department. So you're going to see a tremendous amount of activity take place probably over, it might be as long as another 9 to 12 months of movement towards making these appointments.
All right. Eric Skrmetta, Public Service Commissioner, Chairman of Trump for Louisiana, Dr. Ed Chervenik from UNO, and Dr. Silas Lee from Xavier. We appreciate your time. We will continue to follow everything going on with the president-elect, not just here in Louisiana, but also obviously in the nation's capital in D.C. For now, I'm Travers Mackel. Gina, let's send it back to you at the news desk.